comes to mind when you think about artificial intelligence? Is it a doomsday scenario of robot overlords? The ever-increasing number of AI chatbots like ChatGPT? What about a program that can make art almost indistinguishable from your favorite musicians or painters? Maybe something that seems to be a real person speaking, moving, and responding, but is actually completely composed of code. AI is ever more a part of our lives, especially online, and it raises a whole tangle of questions about what it means to be an artist, a worker, and maybe even a moral human being. Fortunately, there are some sharp minds here in Massachusetts mulling those very questions. I'm Jennifer Smith of Commonwealth Magazine, and this week we're exploring artificial intelligence with Dr. Nir Esikovich. He's a philosophy professor at UMass Boston and founded the university's Applied Ethics Center. Professor Esikovich, thanks so much for joining me today to talk through this very mind-bending topic.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for having me.
Let's start off with a pretty foundational question. How do you define artificial intelligence, and what's the biggest misconception in identifying whether or not something is AI?
Yeah, good that is a good starting place. So artificial intelligence, first of all, the definition itself is in a bit of flux, but at least until recently, the applications that we're primarily familiar with are so-called machine learning applications where um, software is fed a great deal of data, learns to recognize patterns in that data, and then produces predictions on the basis of the data it has learned. More recently, the introduction of generative models, of large language models like ChatGPT and similar ones, have used a variation on that to sort of vector the neighborhood of words and to continually predict what the next word in a sentence that would be, and then to perform the same prediction over and over again. And that's resulted in the pretty remarkable output that we've had from ChatGPT and similar ones. Uh, Misconception. Probably one important misconception is that we're moving closer and closer to a sentient kind of Skynet AI that's capable of generating its own intentions and finally becoming a robot overlord. I think that's not in the cards for the near future.
So, you've written so many interesting pieces about AI and its ethical implications just this year. So, why were you drawn to the topic? What's UMass Boston's involvement in the ethical implications of AI?
Right. So I run the Applied Ethics Center here at UMass Boston, and pretty much from the beginning of the center in 2017, we've had a project on the ethics of emerging technologies, and specifically AI, since in some way it's the most prominent emerging technology. And I think what's so interesting for me and my colleagues about it is not only in some of the traditional moral worries that it raises around privacy or around the kind of scaling of bias, but also how it changes the people who use it, how it sort of psychologically alters us. Does it psychologically alter us in a way that's qualitatively different from what other technologies in the past have done? So yeah, those are some of the questions that draw me in.
Well, let's dig into some of those. You've talked about how AI is killing choice and kind of a way of putting it. So, on a baseline level, how does repeated usage of AI train us to make fewer or different everyday moral judgments?
Yeah, essentially by replacing moral judgments or by replacing practical judgments or by replacing everyday judgments. And what I mean by that is something that's not, fancy or, difficult to wrap one's heads around at all. In more and more contexts of our life, machine learning is making judgment calls that used to be made by people, by, for example, middle management. So if you apply for a mortgage on many platforms, that's an algorithm making the decision of whether you get it. If you Algorithms are making choices about uh, the distribution of healthcare in some context. They're making choices about hiring and firing in some school district. They're making police force allocation choices in places that are understaffed. They're making sentencing recommendations in the context of criminal law. Some of these are and they're certainly making viewing recommendations on Netflix and what you should read next or what you should listen next on Spotify and so on and so forth. And the basic point is like making a judgment, like should somebody get a promotion, should somebody get a mortgage, used to be something that a human being decided by weighing all kinds of particulars, using their spidey sense, whatever. Um, and increasingly they're made by machines. And if using your judgment is a little bit like going to the gym, it's like a muscle of whether you use it or lose it, then more and more we're in more and more context not using it.
So it seems like one of the things you're getting at here is that an advancement in AI is something beyond, for instance, just kind of driving or routing directions, because it's not just making logistical recommendations, it's also making decisions that are kind of freighted with moral weight. Is that kind of a fair way to talk about it?
Yeah, increasingly so. And the technology in a variety of narrow contexts is getting better and better at that. So probably we will get to a state of affairs where AI is going to be better economically and even more fair morally than a human being can be in making a mortgage decision or making a personal loan decision or even making a hiring recommendation. I don't think that's impossible at all. I think there's just a real loss in humans not exercising their judgment capacity. And I'm skeptical about whether this is going to necessarily free them up to exercise it somewhere else.
And so one of the things that this has kind of been tickling the back of my brain about is to what extent the machines or the algorithms or AI are just extensions, really, about sort of the people who program them. We've talked about entrenched bias in the past, obviously, where if there's, for instance, some sort of racial profiling going on and you design a hiring algorithm, it might inadvertently take into account kind of those biases and encode them. So, where are you thinking about the separation of the programmer versus the program?
It's a great question. It's not just the programmer. There's certainly the bias in writing an algorithm. So, for example, if you use zip codes as proxies for the potential to repay a loan, then that's a bias potentially from the person who writes the algorithm, but also from the kind of data that the algorithms are fed in the first place. So famously, for example, some of the early facial recognition technologies, or not so early, some of the facial recognition technologies from recent years were better at recognizing the faces of white men than any other demographic. And the reason was that most of their trading data was that. Um, so both in training data and in the writing of the algorithms in the first place, they reflect biases. But importantly, if there's enough political will and commercial pressure in both, then those biases can be fixed, just like Microsoft fixed its facial recognition software in response to pressure. So in some way, I think the bias question, the extension of bias question, it's like a big question. It's important. But it can be addressed. What I think can't be addressed or is much harder to address has to do with the loss of capacity from this replacing us in some basic functions.
Well, getting to that actually is the question of replacement. Discussions in the labor market have often centered around sort of an industrial model of replacing human labor. You know, it can lift an object that a person can't, it can do something more efficiently. How is AI sort of an advancement on existing sort of technological industrial replacement efforts, and what is kind of new about it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Um, for now, what seems to be happening is rather than jobs being replaced wholesale by jobs, parts of jobs are being replaced. So people's job definitions are changing. I think there's no way around that, meaning that sooner or later you'll need fewer people to generate the same kind of productivity. Um, it's certainly becoming pretty good at replacing the more repetitive parts of white collar work. For example, document review in law firms, and even famously some identification of pathologies and medical images, et cetera, et cetera. So tasks that can be sort of be made more efficient by recognizing large patterns better than we can. So those parts of existing jobs are already changing. Uh, if the chatbots fulfill some of the promise that they look like they're fulfilling, certainly the case that entire jobs can be replaced, from graphic design to content writing for marketing, copy, et cetera, et cetera.
That gets into kind of one of the thorniest, mushiest applications of AI, at least while I've been looking at it, which is kind of how it interacts with the creative field, the things that we tend to attribute as the natural outgrowth of the human soul, so to speak. So when you're thinking about subbing in AI generated writing, for instance, there are plenty of journalistic outlets like Market Watch that might use some sort of kind of generated article reporting, pulling stock data, again, exactly kind of the sort of data combing that you've been talking about. But then you transition into the visual arts or into more kind of creative writing territories. So, how is AI butting up against what we think about in terms of authorship and kind of creative expression?
Yeah, um, it really is. And it's the wild, wild west around those questions right now. So just, I think, over the weekend, a combination of AI techniques was made to create a Drake and the Weeknd song that went absolutely viral. That was probably, I'm assuming, a combination of text generation with a bunch of deep fake voice usage and um, apparently somebody who actually wrote music that it was attached to. But the direction where this is going is that, for example, in music, if you, like the Smiths and you would want them to hear, you would want them to have a reunion or to sing a version of Boys Don't Cry from The Cure, you could probably do that in the very near future. And there's enough Smiths and Cure fans, et cetera, and you can apply this to any artists that I'm sure there would be interest in doing that. So, is that valuable as an artistic creation? Does it count as an artistic creation? I think, those are good. Those are good questions. Or you take the same issue to literature, and you want, you can't wait enough for the next. You can't wait patiently for the next Dennis Lehane thriller, and you say, write me a thriller about resource mining in the voice of Dennis Lehane. It's not quite there, but it's very close to being there. Especially if you look at the pace of progress. Are those products worth anything artistically? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I'd love to separate out kind of two notes that you touched on there. One of them is sort of the sentience issue, the humanity issue, the ability to kind of impersonate or, mimic what would appear to us to be, human action. So looking at the art products that are coming out, one of the questions that's come up a lot with the chatbot specifically is the quality of the work that they're producing, where, you might be getting something that's the equivalent of kind of a decent high schooler's level of writing. But what are you thinking about in terms of the capacity to advance to such a point that it's able to essentially mimic on a one-to-one level the quality of kind of these revered artists?
I think it's just a question of time and not a lot of time. If you look at the progress between ChatGPT 3.5 and 4, I think you have your answer. So I think that is not going to be a question for very long. It also depends on, people are going to come up with specific ways of. So, for example, the Drake Weekend stuff was indistinguishable from their voices. The reason why it was indistinguishable from their voices, if not from their music, was the fact that there was a lot of voice to train it on. Similarly, you're going to be able to write a great essay or a great novel, or the program's going to be able to write a great essay or a great novel if it is trained specifically enough on sufficient number of great essays and great novels, rather than just the whole internet, which is, usually not great. Um, but I think, it raises this kind of question of um, what makes you, my colleague Alex Stubbs and I wrote about this, what makes you appreciate a great performance? What makes you appreciate a great work of art? Is it just the final product, or is it the fact that, there's kind of talent that you can't completely account for or explain that goes into it, and it's the sort of wow factor? There's the philosopher Michael Sandel writes about this in the context of genetic engineering, and he says, the problem with genetic engineering uh, is that it messes with our idea of giftedness. That we admire great performances because they represent a kind of giftedness that awes us, and in the case of technologically generated performance, our admiration moves from the giftedness to an engineer, or to a pharmacist, or to a lab person. And it's not clear that art can still do for you um, what it does under those conditions.
And then, of course, that also implicates the ongoing discussion around impersonation. How is AI interacting with, say, deep fakes? Because it seems like those are also getting better and more accurate over time.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's going to raise real questions about how people can trust what they see. I think it's also going to create, in the end, it's going to create a kind of cynicism that will make people jaded and not necessarily want to consume content. It's interesting. Um, you might sort of want to do a thought experiment of comparing the age of Spotify, where you can listen to all of the world's music at the tip of your fingers in the car, to 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, when you were driving around with your folders of CDs and didn't have, as much choice. When is one listening to more music? When is one more into the music? Is there a point at which the glut of possibilities kind of overwhelms you? Um, you know, how excited are you sort of going to be to buy the next album from your favorite artist when you no longer can tell anything about the process of its production?
So one thing that is striking me as well is there are kind of upsides to this as well, kind of how advanced and how quickly advanced it's becoming. What are some of the ways that, advanced machine learning, either on the creative side or by its ability to kind of drag large amounts of archival data, maybe, are offering some sort of opportunity that we can kind of work with?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Um, if I'm forced to be optimistic about this stuff,
Just for a second.
yeah, which I'm genuinely not. I think it can be, to be serious for a minute, I think it can be used as a sort of creativity prompt. Give me some ideas for writing stories about X, Y, and Z. Make me a personal, make me an initial rough draft so I can sort of overcome a moment of writer's block or blank page anxiety kind of episode. Um, maybe it's a brand new stage in the history of sampling, which was so crucial for the development of hip hop. I don't know. Sampling is amazing, but part of why it's amazing is that it required actual human effort to do the sampling, to choose what is sampled. Um, this is just a little too easy, and I'm not even sure that it counts as sampling anymore. But I think it can be used as a source for generating ideas. Some artists, by the way, have completely invited this and said, "Sure, sample my, use my AI generated voice, and go crazy with it. See what you can do. Whether it's because they're genuinely artistically excited or because they understand that there's no way back from this, and they're trying to figure out how to make a living in a world where this happens. I don't know. What I will say is this. So say somebody, you know, really talented, choose your artist sort of comes on the stage, uh, and puts out, a series of songs. Uh, at a certain moment, if they put out enough songs, their artistic legacy can be carried out without them, and they become obsolete. Once there's enough data to generate deepfake Taylor Swift, it's not clear that you really need Taylor Swift anymore. Um, and you know, that's too bad.
It seems like there is a bit of a thread here as well, where we talked earlier about the moral decision making that you might not be making if AI is kind of filling those gaps. So it seems like you're talking about also a creative decision making that would kind of atrophy.
A creative decision making, absolutely, but also, I talked to a student of mine who's a musician about this in a seminar, and what he said is like, this is the only thing I'm good at, and this is the only thing I like doing, and why would I want to keep doing it? If it's not a function of human talent and creativity anymore. Now, in fairness, these kind of anxieties are always raised about new technologies, but it's also the case, and we forget in the kind of optimistic hype, Silicon Valley inflected world that we live in, that some new technologies have a real cost. So, for example, after iTunes sort of took apart albums for parts so that the unit of consumption became songs, people still make albums, but less. And albums have become only one form of creative expression. And some artists think that there's a lot more to be said for an album than for just releasing singles. And so iTunes, profoundly changed that form of creative expression, and it's not going to go back. And that's even true about earlier technologies, like writing in some important ways killed oral culture, it killed, storytelling. Yes, sure, there's some, storytellers, but it's not ubiquitous. And so there is such a thing as sort of technologically induced cultural loss.
So, picking up on several of the threads that we've talked about so far, is there an implication for kind of government trust, government projects? Deepfakes seem like an obvious issue in terms of kind of how do you trust communications from public officials? How can they trust that they're getting communications from actual constituents? Where are you seeing this interact with the policy space potentially?
Yeah, I think that's wide open and needs to be figured out. Government has to come up with a way to generate trust with constituents, especially as they're worried that the people contacting them are not people and not contacting them. And I think it's a version of a question that exists in a bunch of spaces, like how do I know that my students' essays weren't generated by Chat GPT? And people in universities are scrambling to figure that out. Part of the way that they're going to figure that out, probably in universities, is go back to old-fashioned kind of ways of evaluation, like either handwriting or even more, personal interviews to see face-to-face talking with a student, see if they know the material. That's going to require a lot more time, a lot more resources. Something like that might be have to happen in policy context as well. So we might actually find ourselves going back to some more old-fashioned ways of communicating as a way of circumventing some of these technological risks.
So that does make me wonder, what holes are there in kind of, I'd say, not just structures of law, because obviously AI implicates a lot of copyright questions. It implicates kind of, personal image rights, that sort of thing. But what would you like to see as we start to really kind of get our hands around how AI can change public and civic life? Officials or institutions to start doing to address kind of the exponential growth of this technology?
Yeah. Um, I think people are increasingly starting to think about that. There's a sort of regulatory, the regulatory approach in the European Union and here, for example, are quite different. It's much more on the libertarian light hand here, traditionally, and even for AI, than it is in Europe. There's not a ton of interest in serious regulation here. Um, and I think, that's an obvious area where we have to be paying a lot more attention. So, for example, there's this famous letter a few weeks ago where some tech luminaries have called for freezing ChatGPT at the level of ChatGPT 4 so it can't do any more damage in terms of misinformation, hacking, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but it wasn't very specific. So freezing it for what? Some people have suggested. I think Ezra Klein suggested, well, maybe you should freeze it so that you can freeze it until you can totally reverse engineer how it generates its answers, or freeze it until you can figure out what it would take for an AI not to uh, undermine some of our basic values as it tries to blindly pursue its own purposes. Namely, how do you make sure it doesn't start a war as part of driving the stock price of something up? So I think we are either going to have to sort of abandon some of our traditional, very libertarian approach to the regulation of new technologies, or we're going to be in big trouble.
That is all the time we have for this episode of the podcast. Professor Esakovitz, thank you for being with us today, and to our listeners, we'll be back in your ears next week.